I'm very excited today to introduce to you Cathy O'Neil, who will be speaking to us about her book, Weapons of Math Destruction. Cathy is uniquely well equipped to talk about the subject of mathematical models and how they can go bad. She has a Ph.D. in math from Harvard University. She has held positions at Barnard College and MIT. She's worked at the hedge fund D. Shaw, and also as a data scientist at various startups. She also is active in the Occupy Wall Street movement, especially in their alternative baking group. She blogs at mathbabe.org. It's a great blog. You should check it out, as well as participates in the Slate Money podcast. And she is the author or co-author of 2 other books, Doing Data Science and on being a data skeptic. Please join me in introducing Cathy O'Neil.
Hi guys, thanks so much for coming. So I'm a math nerd. I love math. I was attracted to math in high school because it was true. It was beautiful. Like, you could disagree with somebody about politics and everything, about what manifest destiny really meant, but you'd have to agree on math because you'd be so careful with your assumptions and then your logical arguments. I thought of it as something, wouldn't it be beautiful if we could sort of port this honesty and truth and clarity to other fields of the real world? So after I became an assistant professor at Barnard College, I realized that it wasn't the right pace for me, that I wanted to have like more to do with the real world. And it was 2007, so I did what everybody else does, and I went to a hedge fund, and quickly realized that, well, the world blew up almost the moment I stepped into the hedge fund. Was working with the experts, like Larry Summers. I worked with him on a couple projects. Was very disillusioned by what the experts seemed to actually know about what was going on. But I was most disillusioned and actually ashamed, to be honest, about one of the most fundamental reasons that the financial crisis happened, which was the AAA ratings on the mortgage-backed securities, which I consider a mathematical lie. It was the opposite of how I had fallen in love with mathematics as something that would bring forth clarity. It was hiding corrupt practices behind mathematics. Like, trust the math, be impressed by the fact that we have a bunch of PhDs in math who are supposedly, carefully going through this data to double check, triple check that these mortgage-backed securities are very unrisky. Trust us. There's math here, and invest in these very opaque instruments. And I'm not saying that's the only thing that happened. Obviously, the mortgage brokers made a bunch of bad mortgages, but the reason that they were able to build this machine and scale it to the scale, the massive international scale that it became, was largely because of the AAA ratings, because of the trust, and that was trust in mathematics, and it was abused. I left finance after a small stint in risk, which I could go into if you guys are interested in the Q&A, where I was equally disillusioned by the part I was playing, in particular, in risk. And I left finance altogether, started my blog, Math Babe. The idea was to sort of expose corrupt practices and mathematical abuse, as I saw it, which had happened in finance. In the meantime, I needed a day job, so I became a data scientist very easily, I should say. I just renamed myself a data scientist and got a job the next day. Because I was qualified. Because what do? When you're a data scientist, you predict people instead of predicting markets. I had been predicting markets, futures, and credit default swaps and stuff. So it wasn't that much of a stretch to predict people. In fact, it was very, very simple. And I wanted to think that what I was doing was less destructive than how I'd been feeling in finance. But what I realized pretty quickly, within a year or so, is that I was just very much part of something that I still considered not not benign, like actually negative. And what I realized was that the difference between the sort of the havoc that was created by the financial crisis, where everybody had noticed, and the financial systems of the entire universe, of the entire world, were sort of at risk, and everyone was worried, was that the crisis, the sort of the destruction that was being, that was the havoc that was being wreaked, and the data science world was happening at the individual level. That individuals were being lost, or they were being deemed losers or winners by this stuff. And moreover, what was most disillusioning and kind of frightening for me, because I was still kind of idealistic, was that these were all being, again, they were being sort of marketed as objective and fair, these algorithms, when in fact they were not that. Algorithms are nothing more than opinions embedded in code. So let me give you an example, and you guys are technical, so you'll understand this quite well. This is my son. I like to give the example of what is an algorithm by using the example of my own internal algorithm for cooking dinner for my family. So an algorithm essentially has two big choices, lots of little choices, which I'll ignore. But the big choices are the data that you train your algorithm on, and the definition of success, or the objective function, which also includes your penalty for mistakes, but ignoring that for now. So what's the data going into my algorithm for cooking a meal? Well, it's the food I have in my kitchen, the time I have, the ambition I have. By the way, I should say I curate that already. I curate the food. I do not consider ramen noodles food. My teenagers do. I have teenage sons as well. So I'm already imposing my definition of food. Okay? And then the definition of success for me for dinner is whether my kids ate vegetables. Now my 7-year-old, if he were in charge, this guy right here, Wolfie, he would define success for a meal as if he got a lot of Nutella. And the reason this matters is because over time, we optimize our algorithms for success. I mean, that's why we define it, right? We want to get closer and closer to that success. So over time, that means I make more and more meals that have been successful in the past. I train my algorithm to success. That is a very different succession of meals than my son's algorithm would be if we optimize on Nutella. So that's me imposing my agenda onto the algorithm. We always do that. There is no such thing as objective algorithm, because at the very least, the person building the algorithm defines success. And that's usually success for them. But there's often other stakeholders in the play, and the question is that success for the stakeholders as well? It's not always. It's generally speaking, the patterns I found looking through more and more data science was that we were more and more talking, like marketing these things as fair and objective and following the numbers and mathematical, but there were people behind it who were building the definitions of success, these objective functions, and they were essentially invisible behind that mathematical shield. A lot of these algorithms were benign or fine or great, but some of them were really not great, and I focus on those in my book. I focus on those because I do not like vague discussions about what could go wrong with a bunch of big data. I want to know exactly what is going wrong right now. It's a kind of triage on the world of algorithms. So I focus specifically on the worst possible algorithms. If you're wondering why I'm so negative in my book, I'm not actually negative. I love data. I'm a data scientist still, and I believe in data. But I do want to make it very clear to the public, and this book is written for the public, that some of the times this stuff is really fucked up. And I define that with 3 characteristics. A weapon of math destruction is one of these really terrible algorithms. They have 3 characteristics. One is that they're widespread, important. Okay, so nobody cares about the algorithm I make food for my kids with. That is not important. What's important, what makes something important is it happens to a lot of people and it makes big decisions for them. Of course, algorithms don't make big decisions. To be clear, it's humans that have set up processes by which a score of an algorithm ends up being a decision. But I'm going to, let's just put that aside for now. If people's life's options, important life options, like whether they get a job, whether they go to school, whether they get a loan, how much they pay for insurance, how long they go to jail, if those kinds of things are determined in part by algorithms, essentially mostly scoring systems, then they're important. They're widespread and important. The second characteristic of things I'm really worried about is the mysteriousness, the secrecy. These scoring algorithms, in general, are things that the formulas are not available for people who are being scored by them. Often, they are not even aware that they are being scored. And because they are important, that is not okay. Because they are tantamount to laws, it is not okay for them to be secret. We have a constitutional right to know what the laws of our country are. And finally, I care about algorithms not that are improving the world, I mean, those are great, but that are destructive. So I'm really focused on things that are destructive, and I mean that in two ways. Like the first way I mean that is that they ruin people's lives unfairly. So those people whose important life decisions are being informed by these scores, they're getting unfairly booted from opportunities. Opportunities are unfairly being taken from them. Moreover, they're destructive in a larger sense. They actually set out to solve a problem in a larger sense usually, often with good intentions. But not only do they fail to solve that problem, but they actually make the problem worse. They create usually a destructive feedback loop. And I'm going to give you a bunch of examples, and then we'll have Q&A. So the first example comes from teacher assessment. We've had a basically 2 decades-long war on teachers in this country. The idea is we have a problem with education, let's find the bad teachers and get rid of them. And I will put aside for now the question of whether we could actually solve our problems, and the big problem being the achievement gap between rich and poor kids. Could we solve that by getting rid of bad teachers? That's a different question. The point is that we have been looking for these bad teachers so we can get rid of them for 2 decades. The first generation of teacher assessment tools was really, really stupid and unfair. And here's how it was. Look for teachers, a majority of whose students did not pass some proficiency standard in their standardized tests. Now, the thing you need to know to understand this is that there's a strong correlation between scores on standardized tests and poverty. So poor kids just don't do as well on standardized tests. That's not specific to the United States. That's true over time. That's true internationally. But what it means is that if you target a teacher as, if you label them as bad because a lot of their kids do not pass a certain threshold of proficiency, you're basically targeting teachers of poor kids. So that was clearly unfair. So it was discarded. The second generation was meant to be more fair. And it had good intentions, but it didn't work. And let me tell you what it was. It was called the value-added teacher model. And the idea here is that you can't really blame a teacher if a kid gets like a 60 in 4th grade and they're the 5th grade teacher. You can't blame them if they don't get 100 at the end of 5th grade, right? They're starting from 60. So it's just better if they get more than expected, right? So the idea was there was a primary model, which is the expected score for each student in a class. And then there was the actual score that that kid got at the end of the year. And the teacher was basically held accountable for the difference between those 2 scores. So if their expected score was 62, but they got a 65, the teacher was sort of given credit for those 3 points. If they were supposed to get a 62, but they got a 55, they were dinged for those 7 points that they didn't get. Does that make sense? Now the problem with this, it actually makes sense, right? And if you had like a Google level test of this where instead of having 25 kids in the class, you had 20,000 kids in this class, then the statistical signal will be pretty clean. The problem is we do not have that. So what we have instead is a pretty bad model, which is estimating the expected score for a kid at the end of a year. It's actually really hard to take a kid at the end of 4th grade and estimate what they're going to get at the end of 5th grade. It's not a precise thing. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially for kids in poverty. Then the second source of uncertainty is like what they actually got at the end of 5th grade. Like they could have gotten more if they'd taken the test in the morning instead of the afternoon, or in an air-conditioned room instead of a hot room, or after they ate a meal because they were hungry. So there's a lot of uncertainty on both those numbers, and then you're taking the difference. If you think about statistically, that's the noise term. It's called the error term of that expected score model. So you're holding teachers accountable for the error terms of their students. Turns out it's not a very good model. It's noisy, very, very noisy. Now, I don't know this because I have the algorithm, because I tried to get it. I did a Freedom of Information Act request for the source code, but it was denied me. I ended up talking to someone in Wisconsin. This is for the New York City version. There's versions all over the country, but I focus on the New York City version. And I eventually talked to the people that in Madison, Wisconsin, who built that model, and they explained to me that I would never get the source code for that, because in fact, nobody in New York City got the source code for that, because by the contract, it was stipulated that it was proprietary. So no one in the Department of Education understood how these teachers were being evaluated. And yet, these scores were being used to deny people tenure. So that's why, I should mention, the reason why I thought I might be able to get the source code through a Freedom of Information Act is because the New York Post actually did get the scores with all the teachers' names through a Freedom of Information Act request. And they published them all as an act of shaming the teachers with bad scores. And I thought, okay, maybe I can get the source code. If you can get the scores, I can get the way the scores were made, right? No, I couldn't. But here's something that happened. This really smart high school math teacher at Stuyvesant High School, Gary Rubenstein, he took those same numbers that the New York Post had gotten, and he found teachers that had 2 scores for the same year. You can get 2 scores if you teach 7th grade math and 8th grade math. And he figured if they're both supposed to be like the final say on whether you're a good teacher, they should be consistent, right? So if you get a 75 for 7th grade math, you should get a 78 maybe for 8th grade math, right? Or a 72. So he plotted them in a scatterplot. It looks almost like uniform distribution, which is to say almost random. It's actually 24% correlation. There's some signal in it, which is why I said the thing about like if you had 10,000 kids in your class, you might actually know whether your teacher brings up grades, scores. But it's simply not good enough to hold someone accountable for that at an individual level. But we trusted it anyway. When I say we, I mean the DOE, essentially because they didn't understand it. In spite of that, Sarah Wysocki, who's pictured here, was fired after she got a bad teacher assessment, 50% of which was her teacher value-added model score in Washington, D.C. in 2011. I should say it's 50% of her score, but it's more than 50% of the variance of the score. The big complaint of the way that teachers were assessed was that everybody got the same grade from their principal. The principals would categorize them all as acceptable teachers. So they were like, we need some spread in these scores so we can like rank the teachers and find the worst 2%. So they got spread, but the question was, is it meaningful? I claim it's not meaningful from the scatterplot we just saw. But it was particularly irksome for Sarah because guess what? She was teaching in 5th grade. A bunch of 4th graders came in with very high scores at the end of 4th grade who couldn't read or write. And it turns out that in the Washington, D.C. district, Michelle Rhee had instituted both carrots and sticks. You get bonus if you get a high value-added model score or high teacher assessment. You get fired if you get a bad one. So, moreover, she found out that the school where some of her kids came from had exceptionally high erasure rates for their end-of-year standardized tests. So she has reason to believe that the previous teachers actually cheated on the test. If you think about what that would mean, those kids get elevated scores, and they're expected to keep them elevated at the end of her class. But she just got them, she taught them well, but they didn't get ridiculously high scores, so she got punished for the previous teachers cheating. I should mention that she got a new job a couple days after she got fired in an affluent suburb of Washington, D.C., because most of these, this is where the value-added model is being used. I think it's actually more than that at this point, mostly in urban school districts. So that brings me to the failure, okay? Remember I said there's failure on, well, let me just go back over the 3 things. It's widespread, secret, and it's destructive. At an individual level, so we saw Sarah losing her job, and at a systemic level. I claim that the value-added model does not get rid of bad teachers. Remember, the whole point was get rid of the bad teachers, then we'll solve the problem with education. We're not getting rid of bad teachers, we're getting rid of good teachers. We got rid of Sarah, which was just dumb, but there are countless teachers who have quit, who have retired early, who who have not gone into teaching. We have a national teacher shortage. Or have fled to the suburbs where they don't use this arbitrary and punitive regime for teachers. My next example comes from the world of personality tests. This is Kyle Beam. He was a college student in the Atlanta area. He wanted to get a job after school at a grocery store, Kroger's. And he took a personality test. He failed it. Most people never find out they failed it, but he found out because his friend worked at Kroger's, who told him. So he was unusual in finding out that he got red lighted from this algorithm, which was built by Kronos, a small big data company, actually in this neighborhood. The other thing that was unusual about Kyle is that his father's a lawyer. Most people that are applying for minimum wage jobs, which this was, do not have fathers that are lawyers. So his father said, what were the questions like on this test? And Kyle said, they were a lot like the questions I got at the hospital when I was being treated for bipolar disorder. The 5-factor model, it's called. And his father said, well, that's illegal under the Americans with Disability Act. It's illegal to have a health exam, including a mental health exam, as part of a job application. And he said, well, can you apply to other places? Kyle ended up applying to 6 other places: Lowe's, Yum Food, which owns Taco Bell, other big companies. They all had exactly the same personality test, and he failed all of them. So his father's suing those 7 companies on behalf, as a class action lawsuit, on behalf of anyone who's ever taken that test on the grounds that it is illegal. And it violates the Americans with Disability Act. So that's widespread. It's secret. I should mention, personality tests are not new. Radio Shack, old sort of easily gamed personality tests looked a lot like this. Agree or disagree, I'm always happy. I think your employer wants you to agree with that. These are the more recent ones, much harder. What do you agree with more? I sometimes get confused by my thoughts and feelings, or I don't really like it when I have to do something I haven't done before. Imagine doing 50 of those. So it's absolutely inscrutable. So it's secret, and I would say it's destructive. It's destructive for Kyle because he didn't get a job at any of those big companies he applied to in the entire area of Atlanta. But it's also destructive in a larger sense if what we're worried about is true, that they're actually sort of systematically denying employment to an entire subpopulation, people with mental health problems. It's not relegated to minimum wage work, this idea of having algorithms that sort through resumes. Do you guys know who this is? This is Roger Ailes. He recently got kicked out of Fox News. He led Fox News for a long time. Got kicked out for basically sexually harassing women and keeping them from getting promoted. So it's doing a thought experiment. I don't know if Fox News uses an algorithm to hire people, but I'm just imagining that they do. Play along with me. What does that algorithm take in? Well, it takes in data, probably historical data, from Fox News. So all the history of people who've applied to be, say, anchors at Fox News. And then it takes a definition of success. What does a good employee a successful employee at Fox News look like? Let's just say, let's stipulate a successful employee at Fox News stays for 3 years and gets promoted at least once. Okay? That's typical for how these algorithms are designed and how they're trained. So if you think about what that means, the algorithm, if you've trained it on a lot of historical data, what it will do is, given a new set of applicants for an anchor job, it will say, who among these new applicants looks like someone who was successful in the past? And I would not be surprised if it filtered out women. Because not only did women not necessarily get that job as often, but when they did get the job, they were systematically pushed out by Roger Ailes and the entire culture there. Does that make sense? So the point here, and this is a very important point, is that we do not improve, algorithms are not inherently objective or fair. All they are doing, what they're really good at is picking out past patterns and repeating them. Which is to say, if we had a perfect way of hiring people, we would want to codify that. We would want to automate that because it would save us money and time. But until we have a perfect way of doing this, all we're doing is we are literally codifying past practices and propagating them. My last example comes from criminal justice. There's actually two different kinds of algorithms that worry me a lot in the criminal justice. The first is predictive policing. You guys know all about the Black Lives Matter movement, which is objecting to black people getting shot. But it's not just, of course, being shot, it's just the amount of over-policing and uneven policing that's happening to poor black communities. Some evidence. There's whites and blacks smoking pot at similar rates, whites smoking pot a little bit more if they're young. But blacks get arrested a lot more for that. In fact, depending on the jurisdiction, blacks can get arrested up to 10 times more often than whites for smoking pot. Okay, so the two things I want you to take away from this are blacks, it's biased against blacks, and actually it depends very much on local conditions of how the police force is expected to act. So when you hear about arrest records, I want you to think just as much about police practices as you do about crime, at least when it's nonviolent crime. And I do make a distinction between violent crime and nonviolent crime. The problem is that nonviolent crime is much more prevalent and it is much more predictable. Think about it. We have people being arrested in this country for mental health problems when they're poor, not when they're rich. We have people being arrested for addiction problems when they're poor. And we have people being arrested much more often for low-level, nonviolent crime like drug use. And for that matter, for like crimes of poverty, just like literally not having a place to go to the bathroom. And that goes into their arrest records. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the way predictive policing works is very simple. It's actually very stupid. It's geolocated arrest records, and the algorithm says, go put police where we saw crime in the past, which is really where we saw arrests in the past, where we saw police arresting people for things in the past. This is just as much a way of predicting the police as it is of predicting crime. I'm just reiterating that. It might be different, by the way, if we really focused only on violent crime. Imagine that. Imagine a predictive policing algorithm where they only focus on violent crime like murder. Okay? The problem is that murder is really hard to predict. Like even if you did predict murder, would you stand outside a house waiting for someone to get murdered? Like the problem is that the things that are actually easy to predict are things like poverty. So my claim is that predictive policing is more or less creating a feedback loop where you're having a pseudoscientific basis for sending police back to neighborhoods that are already overpoliced. Said another way, another thought experiment, imagine that if after the financial crisis, all the cops had been told to go to Wall Street and arrest the bankers and find out if they had cocaine in their pockets, because they all do, not all of them. Then the police records, the police data, which is just a reflection of what police do, right? The data would tell them in these predictive policing algorithms, go back to Wall Street because that's where the crime is. But that's not what we did. So the next example, also in the criminal justice system, is recidivism risk. This is a score. Recidivism, by the way, is coming back to jail. So recidivism risk is the risk somebody comes back to jail. Recidivism risk scores are given to judges when they sentence criminal defendants. Now, there's two kinds of data that goes into that. One is arrest records. We just talked about arrest records. They're very biased. The second is a questionnaire. The most commonly used recidivism risk algorithm is called the LSIR, and I'm going to show you a couple of the questions that are asked of the defendant in the LSIR. Number 29, do you live in a high crime neighborhood? It's a proxy for class and race, because that is pointing to people who are already poor and black. And by the way, if you say yes or no to these things, it goes exactly as you imagine. If you say yes to, I have a mental health problem, you're higher risk, right? And oh, I forgot to mention, if you're higher risk, well, a judge will sentence you to longer in jail. which doesn't, I mean, I mention that because it's not obvious that that's what you would do, right? Like if you're higher risk of recidivism, you get put in jail longer. It's a little bit minority reportish because what you're doing is you're preemptively punishing someone for something they haven't done yet. But that is the practice that judges now have. Here's another set of questions. Have you been suspended from school? Number 17. I'll show you a plot of just how much that is a proxy for race. Black girls and boys are much more likely to be suspended from school. But I think the thing that bothers me the most, and I think should bother absolutely everyone, is number 26. Was somebody in your family in prison? This is something that in an open court would be thrown out by a judge as unconstitutional. If a lawyer said, Your Honor, please sentence this person to longer because their father was also a criminal. That is not how we do it. But because it's being embedded in a risk score, which is being claimed to be scientific, this somehow has the authenticity of mathematics and science. And again, is being used to send people to jail for longer. So I talk about failures. I should also mention this is important. It's being used in more than half the states. It's secret. People do not understand what they're getting into with these scores, and judges are actually very secretive about exactly how much weight they put on these scores. But my claim is that they are the most destructive thing you can imagine. They create their own reality. If you're a higher risk, you're sentenced to jail for longer, and guess what? If you're sentenced to prison, if you're in prison longer, you don't tend to benefit from that experience. You end up out of jail. 97% of people eventually leave prison, I should mention. So this happens. But you end up with no resources, no connections to your community, very little wealth. You have a felony to your name often, so it's hard to get a job. And then you end up back in prison, partly because you got this high risk score. So you were deemed high risk, and then you end up back in prison. So I'm almost done. Those are my examples. But I do want to mention, again, that I don't hate data. I just really think we have not yet started understanding what it means to build safe algorithms. It's like we are building cars and just putting them on the road without understanding that cars can kill people. So I want data scientists to take their ethical responsibility seriously, which means building some kind of ethical framework like a Hippocratic Oath for data scientists. I also think that we need to learn how to scrutinize these algorithms, to monitor them, to audit them for safety, for fairness and discrimination, and for meaning, making sure that we're actually building meaningful things. Where the teacher value-added model was not meaningful. And I also think that in situations where it's very, very important to a given person's life, how they're being scored, they should have the right to scrutinize that score. Like the teachers. Like if they are being given a score that will maybe make them fired, they should be able to understand exactly how that scoring system works. Because to be clear, the teachers were not, even when they appealed their score, they were not told how they were being actually evaluated. And that's not right. Thank you, guys. If you have any questions, I'm here.
Hi. What's the best way to account for and mitigate limitations in a model? So suppose you had to come up with a mathematical model to affect somebody's life. How do you figure out where the boundaries of application are, and how do you, I guess, iteratively readdress that to see if it's doing what you expect it to?
I mean, it's really a vague question, so it's hard for me to answer. I think it's like, I'll tell you how frustrating it is as a data scientist. I'm a data scientist. Like, I worked in the City Hall of New York, and I was asked to use the data they had to figure out how long a family was going to be in homeless services. And I had race, I had the number of children, I had how many whether the parents had been in social services. I had all this data, but they weren't telling me how they were going to use this algorithm, this scoring system, once I had it. So in particular, one thing I didn't know whether I should use was the attribute race, or all the other things that are proxies to race, or should I decorrelate those other things from the race. How is this going to be used? Number one possibility, if you were high risk, then you're going to be put into worse housing. If you were expected to be in long-term housing, you're going to be put into worse housing. If I did that, if I knew that was how it was going to be used, then I would know that people at higher risk, there would be a disparate impact racially, right? But if instead it was being used to sort of figure out interventions, so that black families, maybe they wanted to understand why black families were in homeless services for longer, and to intervene to try to make that discrepancy smaller, then it would by all means make sense to have race as the attribute. Does that make sense? So I'm basically not answering your question, but I am making it clear that you cannot answer that question until you really know the use case for this algorithm. And I should also add that a given algorithm could have a positive or a negative effect on the world. It's really tricky. These things are, let me give you an example. Health. Everyone's talking about how great it is that we can predict each other's health. Well, that's great if your doctor has that algorithm and can keep you well, but it's not great if an insurance company has that algorithm and can charge you more if you're about to get sick, or if Walmart, and I'm not saying this is happening, but if Walmart puts a health risk on top of everybody who's applying to their job and says, we don't want to spend money on people's insurance, so we're going to not hire people with high health risks. I mean, I'm just saying, same algorithm, different use cases could be used for good or bad. And so the answer is, there is no rule here. These are algorithms are decision-making processes that are as complicated as anything in the world. So we can't pretend that there are formulas for how to use them and how to make them safe. They're very, very contextual.
Do you have any sense of, this is probably a naive question, but whether the scale of the problem is bigger or smaller in a country with stronger libel and slander laws, like, for example, England?
Say more. Why would you imagine that?
Why would I imagine it would be different?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the people who are victims probably don't have the resources to pursue slander cases anyways.
I think that's a very important point. Thank you for making it, which is that one of the commonalities of almost all these algorithms is that the people who are losing by these scoring systems are often the most vulnerable people in our society. So they do not have, generally speaking, they don't have lawyers to protect them, right? But I would also say the following, anonymization, which is a tool that people often bring up as a way of solving some of these problems, is not really a solution to me. Let's think about the medical model I just mentioned. Let's say I'm Walmart, and again, Walmart's not necessarily, I'm a large employer, and I get long-term health data off of all my employees because I force them to use Fitbits or whatever I do, right? I get long-term health outcomes. And I don't charge them, they're already my employees, I treat them well, right? But the point is I can build the algorithm, I can build the neural network, whatever have you, I can train it so that when someone applies to my job, I only have to ask them 6 questions, and I've already categorized, I've segmented them into a risk group score. And it is completely anonymous. And in other words, you can build an algorithm anonymously and still apply it to someone in a very precise way, and it still can be problematic. So it's really not, for me, it's not about anonymity.
So in a lot of the reporting that I have read about this sort of thing, and I'm thinking specifically, for example, the ProPublica had a long thing on the criminal justice, the sentencing thing. I haven't seen a lot of talk about how these algorithms perform relative to, in this example, just a judge without this, score, or what the pre-existing case was.
Yeah, great point. And I'm desperate for that, right? Because the point is that the justice system is very racist already. The intention of this recidivism risk stuff was to make judges more objective and less racist. And it might be doing that. With all the flaws that I just mentioned, which I really believe in, it might actually still be better than what we have already. We do not have data for that. And the Department of Justice is not coughing up that data. I've tried to get data to do that, an audit of the DOJ. It's possible. The data exists because some jurisdictions have this stuff in use and some of them don't. You could just compare them before and after or whatever and compare to each other. I should also add that, like, here's the good news. Like, if we made those recidivism risk algorithms actually not racist, then that would definitely be better than the current judges. It's like we threw them out there and we're just like, oh, they must be good because they're algorithms. They're by definition good. No, they're not necessarily good. But again, you're right, they might be better than the existing system.
So in the other examples that you talked about, do you have similar sense of whether that data is out there? Like the teachers and, and maybe the teachers is a bad example.
The teachers it's just terrible.
You're not even trying to solve the right problem there.
They're not solving the right. And I don't think, by the way, I still don't think recidivism risk being high shouldn't necessarily mean you go to jail longer, right? Maybe we should be like, why do we sentence people the way we sentence people? Like, we should maybe make a redo of that entire conversation. Like, we should, if we were thinking data-drivenly, if we're Google thinking people, like, we should ask really basic questions, like, to what extent does GED training in a prison help people when they leave? To what extent does solitary confinement help or hurt people, or sexual assault? Like, we should actually know what these things are doing to our final outcomes, which hopefully is a combination of public safety and the well-being of the actual prisoners. We don't have any of that. Yeah.
I entirely agree with your wonderful notion that some of this data is disparate. I mean, it hurts vulnerable communities. But despite that, like the thing you most drew attention to was the fact that people whose relatives are criminals are judged more likely to commit crimes. Well, people whose relatives are actors are more likely to become actors. People whose relatives are plumbers are more likely to become plumbers. And even though it's a horrible thing, I strongly suspect that someone whose parents grew up by stealing cars know a heck of a lot more about stealing cars than someone who don't. What do you suggest?
I suggest we follow the Constitution, which privileges justice over anything like that.
So just
the
throw it
way
out
our
and
Constitution is written.
Send the police to Wall Street because it's equally likely to have muggings.
As a culture, we decide what is against the law. But the Constitution declares that we have to care about fairness to the criminal above all. And this is not fairness to the criminal by saying you're implicated because your father was implicated. And I also want to add that, like, I live next to Columbia University, and every couple of years there's a huge drug bust in the fraternities, right? Like a huge drug bust. And then I followed the NYPD, and they're constantly boasting about their data-driven criminal justice stuff and how they peg people as gang members if they associate it on social media with gang members. But those gang members are always in Harlem and they're black. Do you see what I mean? They're not Columbia students. So it's also an inconsistently defined association. So there's two different kinds of problems.
Okay, I see the point. Thank you.
Yep.
So I think it's very easy to see that if you're not careful about how you define what kind of success you're optimizing for, you wind up with an algorithm that very strongly reinforces the status quo. And if we're looking at things, like our hiring practices fair, then if there is existing unfairness, we're going to perpetuate it. So that makes total sense to me. What I struggle with is if I'm asked to do something like that, and I try to not incorporate the existing structural biases into the algorithm that's going to be my new, recommended hiring practices thing, how do I deal with the challenge that I'm actually optimizing away from success conditions?
Okay, so there's two strategies I suggest. The first one is basically a parable. So there's this thing called the blind audition for orchestras, right? where the orchestras were they acknowledged that they were being nepotistic in their practices of hiring. So they wanted to get rid of their nepotism. So they decided to put a sheet between their judges and the auditioner so they wouldn't know if the person who was behind the sheet was their friend. At first, they saw the shoes, and then they were like, wait a second, we can see if it's a man or woman. So they brought the sheet down to the ground, and they also installed rugs in the hallway walking up to the spot so they couldn't hear if it's high heels or not. Not only did they get rid of nepotism, but they increased the number of women in orchestras by a factor of 5. So that's the story. And like the way I would characterize what they successfully did there is two things. First, they decided a priori what was it that was a requirement for this job. How do you assess somebody for this job? And the answer was sound. The second thing they did, which was absolutely as important as the first thing, was to ignore everything else. The promise of big data that we get confused by because it sounds really convincing, but it's wrong. The promise of big data is the more the data is, the better. Just throw all this data at the wall. Correlations are just as good as causation. Not true. Because if we did the orchestra example again, but we didn't have the sheet, and we thought to ourselves, we're looking for good sound, but we also knew that it was our friend, or we also knew that it was a woman, that creeps into us. It creeps into our brain. That's excess information that we should be ignoring, but we're not ignoring. So the first strategy I would suggest for hiring people is to think a priori, to actually build a model that that by construction is fair. So build the model and say, these are the things we actually want for this job. The second possibility is use a machine learning algorithm that takes all these correlations and blah, 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 but then audit it for fairness. Then say, wait, does this basically filter out women? Check. Check to see if women are filtered out. Check to see whether they're filtered out in a reasonable way. Sometimes they are. Sometimes I heard this story on Twitter just the other day, where way more Asian people were filtered out of a certain job, and people were complaining because so many of the applicants were Asian. But then people were saying, well, there were more Asians that were applying that weren't actually qualified for this job. Like, it's complicated, and expect it to be complicated. That's my third suggestion. Is that the other promise of big data that I'm pushing back against, and I hope you understand and agree with, is that big data is not a silver bullet. It's just a tool. And is not automatically going to solve our problems. It's just a tool that we might be able to use to solve some of our problems. But we have to be careful about it, and we have to check.
You have many other success stories where you would go to a judge or a jurisdiction or a school system, and they would say, oh my God, you're right, we have to fix this, and they do.
Sorry, what?
Do you have any other success stories like the orchestra where you might go to someone and say, there's this problem, and they say, oh my gosh, as opposed to, no, you can't see our data, no, that's proprietary, go away, don't bother us.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how few people want me to see their source code. Although I should say that, someone asked me whether I thought it would just be impossible to ever get a good value out of, a good teacher assessment tool using data. And I said, I'll never say never, because 10 years ago, I didn't think we'd have self-driving cars. But I think now that we're going to save lives from drunk driving with self-driving cars. But what is it going to take to get a good teacher assessment tool is we're going to have a lot of evidence that this is actually working. Right now, we have no ground truth for teacher value added model. Literally, there is no comparison to some other kind of qualitative assessment to see whether a good teacher is getting a good score and a bad teacher is getting a bad score. It's just whatever the number is your score, which is ridiculous, right? So we actually do have qualitative assessments for teachers. They're political because different people disagree about what makes a good teacher. But let's say we had agreement. We're defining this kind of qualitative assessment to be important, to be the ground truth. And then we could try to find, maybe we put a bunch of sensors in the classroom. We try to replicate that using data, literally replicate it. And if we got an algorithm that after 4,000 teachers got almost exactly the same score using the qualitative assessment as using this data-driven assessment, then we would build trust that this data-driven assessment is doing a good job. It's very similar to saying, we have this many miles of a self-driving car without an accident. So we start trusting that car, that algorithm. Does that make sense? Right now, we have nothing like that in the field of teacher value. They just want a silver bullet. That's all they want. They don't want any prying eyes either.
Something that's kind of come up a bunch is sort of as an undercurrent, like the idea of open sourcing how you're doing things. And I can see that like potentially being really helpful. For example, now you can actually criticize because you can see the code. But I can also see it being somewhat ineffective if you're still asking questions that are totally beside the point. So I guess I'm curious about your thoughts as to the effectiveness of things like open sourcing and also the limitations.
It's a great question, and you guys know that it's hard because it's relatively easy to make something arbitrarily difficult to understand. If you know in advance that it's going to be open source, you could just make it impossible to understand. And like the other example I give is like nobody would want the code for Google search because literally it probably will not work on any computer system except Google's computer system, right? So there's a limit to what open sourcing can do. But that's not to say I think we should give up. I think what we should ask for is an auditing, like a fairness auditing. And I think we should think about along the lines of the way sociologists audit things for fairness. So like sociologists will see whether a hiring practice is racist by sending a bunch of applications with black names and white names and like similar kind of qualifications and see whether white people get more callbacks. So we can do that kind of thing to algorithms. And LaTanya Sweeney did that for Google search. You guys know that example. Well, LaTanya Sweeney Googled her own name and she found the ad next to the search results was, are you looking for the criminal arrest records for LaTanya Sweeney? Then she Googled a white name, it didn't happen. Then she did a comprehensive test, because she's a computer scientist, and found that black names were way more likely to have arrest records next to them, this ad for arrest records. Now that's not, in my opinion, a weapon of math destruction, because it's not as directly impactful on people's lives, but it's certainly not great. Go ahead.
Thanks. I was just going to agree with you before when you were talking about there's no easy way to do the teacher evaluation. I think it goes back to your point of success, right? Because then it gets into like student evaluation and are, the assessments that they do on students fair, or is that just a proxy for success in long-term, in their long-term career? So I think the teacher evaluation, there's probably no right answer. Do you agree?
Yeah, it's a very tricky problem. So I think the trickier the question is, the less likely it's going to be solved by some simple scoring system.
Yeah. Thank you.
A lot of the machine learning algorithms that are very popular these days are things like neural networks, which they're not designed. They're opaque, without even having bad intentions. Like, if you click on the little Y button about why it made it give a decision, it's to say I did these 3,000 matrix multiplies, and there's no simpler answer than that. But they do give much better predictions than other things like decision trees, which are much more interpretable. Do you have any thoughts about how, in the context of these problems, should we, do giving deliberately worse predictions because we need them to be interpretable? Or?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That's probably the hardest thing that you guys are going to hear from me today, but I definitely think we need to sacrifice accuracy for fairness. Absolutely. And one of the reasons is because we, as technologists, we are not the ones that are at risk. So our concept of what looks fair to us, not good enough, right? We might have some better understanding of how things work, but we're like, oh, but it makes it so much more accurate. And I talked to somebody who does recidivism risk algorithms for a living. He does it for a state. And I said, well, do you ever use race? And he was like, oh, no, that would be wrong. And I said, well, do you ever use zip code? And he was like, well, sometimes, because it makes it so much more accurate. And I'm like, okay, but that's a proxy for race. So you're basically using race. So another way of saying that is if it's interpretable, then it's much more easy for other people to say that's not fair. It's a transparency measure. There is precedent for this, by the way. If in credit card law, if you're a credit card company and you deny someone a credit card, you have to be able to explain why, which restricts people to using decision trees for the most part. They don't like it, but that's okay. There's actually lots of things about lending that are a trade-off for fairness and accuracy. So FICO scores, by law, anti-discrimination law is called Fair Credit Reporting Act, and Equal Credit Opportunity Act, make it illegal for you to base FICO scores on race or gender or zip code. Is that because it's more accurate when you restrict? No, like it's keeping these credit scores for being as accurate as they might be. But it was deemed more fair that way. As a society, we care about the public, right? So the idea is, and this was soon, like, basically this happened in the 70s when, like, especially divorced women were being denied loans. And the idea there was, if you never let women get loans, then they're never going to be able to build up their credit scores so that they'll be creditworthy. So it's like a feedback loop, right? And so these anti-discrimination laws were specifically designed to prevent the feedback loop. And we need that. We need that kind of thing. Because algorithms like that algorithm I just talked about, that benefits the banks or the people that make loans to the detriment of the public. So we have to balance the benefits for the public versus the benefits for the private companies. I have time for one question.
So I was going to say I'm in the opposite boat where I work on a search feature that looks at lots of queries, and we have a model for English where the masculine pronouns are the default and some common names are the default, so the model knows a lot about that, and we're kind of wondering if queries that women like we do terrible on or worse, or there's some class, except we don't know anything about the people who ask the queries. We've tried really hard not to know. I don't know gender, I don't know income. I could probably get zip code in bulk. So I'm sitting here, I'm trying to think how I'd write a machine learning model that would do the reverse question and figure out what's the most unfair thing my current system is up to.
That's a good question to be asking yourself. But I would also add, and thank you for asking that to yourself. I think that's what we all need to ask, because one of the first questions we should be asking ourselves. But I do want to, you made the point yourself, but I'll just reiterate it, and it's something that I'm certainly not the first person to make this point. Sometimes you actually do need to know these attributes like race and gender in order to measure your fairness. So I understand the desire to be race neutral or gender neutral, but that doesn't mean you should not collect that data. Because then you're basically saying, I'm not going to look, like it must be fair because I don't collect that data. That's not proof that it's fair. Which isn't to say that, it's easy to collect that data.
That's not why we don't.
Okay, I'm saying maybe collect it, at least for some experiments as an audit. Thank you, guys.